Hello, I'm Jared Goyette, and welcome to Wrap Up Weekly, where we report on the most important news that happened over the past week for Ukraine. In this episode, you'll see Russians are desperately trying to break through Ukraine's defenses in the north of the country, suffering insane losses. What are they after? The G7 summit ended in nothing. Who is to blame? Putin is trying to threaten NATO, both militarily and with destabilization from within. What is the head of the Kremlin really up to? The Russians have stepped up their offensive operations in the Sumy region in northern Ukraine. According to the General Staff, the occupiers are relocating equipment and combat units from the southern and eastern fronts to this area. Despite their lack of success, the Russians continue their constant attempts to attack the regional center, the city of Sumy. Now, the northern part of this area, near the border, has turned into a giant mass grave. It's essentially a junkyard of burned-out armor and mangled tanks. Yet the assaults continue, and Russian casualties climb by the hundreds. Putin's goal? His so-called sanitary zone, a buffer carved out of Ukrainian territory.
Create such a zone, you'd need an order of magnitude more forces than what is currently deployed in the Sumy direction. Moreover, you might need the same number of troops as the entire Russian group that is currently fighting in Ukraine. So, it comes down to one of two things. Either the Russians are thinking about creating this zone, this dead zone, in the north of our country, or they're giving up on their main offensive in the east of our country. They simply don't have the resources to carry out two such large-scale operations.
Search and rescue operations at the site of the Russian missile attack on an apartment building in Kyiv have ended. The June 17 strike killed 28 people and wounded more than 100. Air raid sirens lasted more than 9 hours with explosions and fires in 27 locations across the city. Apartment blocks, schools, and critical infrastructure were all hit. One missile punched through all 9 floors of a residential building, collapsing the entrance. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko later displayed fragments of the missile's cluster submunitions, proof, as he said, the Russians packed the warhead to maximize civilian casualties.
One of the missiles hit a residential building. Thank God no one was killed. But here's an interesting find. The State Emergency Service and the police collected these kinds of bullets that are found here. These are cluster missiles with cluster munitions inside. These small pellets are inside for the PU for maximum harm to people. Yeah, you can't call this anything other than genocide. EA doing everything possible to ensure the maximum number of people are killed. They use such shells when attacking a peaceful city.
Support for Ukraine and tougher sanctions on Russia were meant to be the headlines for the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Canada, until Washington changed the script. While every other leader called for more pressure on Moscow, President Trump pulled back, saying he won't add new sanctions and instead will wait for the results of the peace talks. The same talks, let me remind you, that the Kremlin keeps stalling.
Because I'm waiting to see whether or not a deal is signed.
Can you guarantee the UK won't be subject?
And don't forget, sanctions cost us a lot of money. When I sanction a country, that costs the U.S. a lot of money, a tremendous amount of money. It's not just let's sign a document. You're talking about billions and billions of dollars. Sanctions are not that easy. It's not just a one-way street.
Trump bailed early on the summit without a clear reason. The Financial Times suggests that it was because of disagreements with Emmanuel Macron. His exit also nixed a planned sit-down with President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was also invited to the summit. In any case, the absence of one of the G7 leaders meant that the summit did not have any common decision or joint statement. Still, the remaining leaders were clear. Pressure on Moscow will keep rising until Putin shows real movement toward peace.
To achieve peace through strength, we must put more pressure on Russia to secure a real ceasefire, to bring Russia to the negotiating table, and to end this war. Sanctions are critical to that end. As a result of the G7 and EU sanctions combined, for example, Russian oil and gas revenues have fallen by almost 80% since the beginning of the war. So the sanctions are working. And we will do more. Last week, we put forward a proposal for an 18th sanctions package. I will invite all G7 partners to join us in this endeavor.
Brussels isn't stopping at tough talk. The EU now wants its partners to squeeze Russia harder, starting with a tighter oil price cap, down to $45 a barrel. Sanctions envoy David O'Sullivan laid this out in an interview with Radio Liberty. Leaders hoped to hash it all out at the summit, but Donald Trump shut the topic down. The plan's still alive, though. How could Europe make it stick? Details in the next report.
All arguments in favour of tightening sanctions and lowering the oil price cap are justified by the aggressor state's behaviour during peace negotiations, said EU sanctions envoy David O'Sullivan in an interview with Radio Free Europe. According to him, pressure on Moscow must increase to force the Kremlin into an unconditional ceasefire. O'Sullivan expressed hope that at the G7 summit in Canada, leaders will succeed in pushing for a lower price ceiling on Russian oil.
There is a G7 working group at the technical level that looked into this issue. I think there was some consensus around $45 as the right level that we should aim for. We'll see how things go in Canada, but we've secured strong support from Canada and the UK. So I think there will be many people who will push hard and argue for moving to this $45 level. David O'Sullivan, European Union Special Envoy on Sanctions, in an interview with Radio Free Europe.
According to Bloomberg, the United States still does not support lowering the oil price cap for Russia. At least, there have been no changes in the position stated by Washington at the G7 finance ministers' meeting earlier this year. However, the final decision rests with President Donald Trump. The EU and the UK continue to advocate for revising the price ceiling for Russian oil. Reuters reports that most G7 countries are ready to support this measure, even if the United States opposes it, because such restrictions do work.
So now, it really is a matter of Western resolves with sanctions, and with Mr. Trump in the White House, there's always question marks over that. If I was being realistic about things, I would hope from this G7 meeting that we get some progress, but I don't think we will see a final outcome on this in the next few weeks.
The aggressor state's economy is heavily dependent on oil and gas export revenues. That's why the recent oil price spike on global markets triggered by Israeli strikes on Iran could benefit Russia, according to the Institute for the Study of War.
After the Israel Defense Forces operation in Iran, Brent crude futures rose more than 5% to $74.47 per barrel. Russia could use the sudden price surge to overcome economic difficulties and finance the war against Ukraine, provided that oil prices remain high, for example, above $60 per barrel, from the report by the Institute for the Study of War.
On June 10th, the European Commission presented a draft of the 18th sanctions package against the Russian Federation. One of the proposed measures is a reduction of the price cap on Russian oil. According to EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, the EU is ready to move forward with these steps, even without US involvement steps that would deal a blow to the Russian economy. The main delivery routes of Russian oil to the EU run through the Baltic and Black Seas, allowing European countries to monitor shipping traffic.
Russia has lost tens of billions in oil revenues, its economy is shrinking, and its GDP has dropped. Sanctioning the shadow fleet has been particularly impactful. After our last sanctions package, the 17th sanctions package, the oil exports from Russia via the Black Sea and Baltic Sea routes declined by 30% in a week. Only in the month of May, Russia's sovereign wealth fund declined by 6 billion from 42 billion to 36 billion US dollars.
And starting January 1st, 2026, the European Commission will ban EU LNG terminals from serving clients from the Russian Federation, Reuters reports, citing a draft regulation. The measure would also prohibit EU member states from importing Russian energy. Under the new rules, European gas importers will be required to disclose the origin of their supplies, allowing EU customs and regulatory bodies to enforce the ban. The regulation is scheduled for publication on June 17th, reported by Christina Dombrovska, UATV News.
Russia continues to amass forces near NATO's borders. Military towns have begun to sprout up, like mushrooms after the rain on the Finnish border. Construction works in Kandalashka in Russia's Murmansk region started last winter. Crews have dug up the area, built new barracks, patched up old buildings, and cleared the grounds. Officials say it will house an artillery brigade and an engineering unit. Until now, it was mainly supply dump. The scale points to a long-term Arctic buildup. Planners said they expect about 2,000 troops, but the real numbers will likely be much higher. Moscow is allocating about 450 million euros for the project.
Russia has two reasons to increase military activity near Finland. The first and more urgent reason is to train military personnel and service older equipment so it can be used for the war in Ukraine. This is evident from the IL's earlier findings based on satellite images. In contrast, the new satellite images from Lubcha Savino obtained by the IL are evidence of a new and different development. Russia is seeking to permanently reinforce its troops specifically along the border with Finland. From the publication of the Finnish broadcaster IL.
Satellite images show fresh buildup at Sapornoye, a village about 70 kilometers from Finland's border. New engineering equipment, including pontoon bridges, have arrived. The buildup appears linked to a nearby garrison, where an existing brigade is being upgraded to a full division, nearly tripling its manpower. In Petrozavodsk, further south, Russia has also stepped up its military logistics. Armored depots are being restocked, a railway bridge has been established, and a new aviation division headquarters has been set up. All of which points to a full-fledged military command post being established in the area. In addition, Russia is forming a new 44th Army Corps in Karelia, which comprise up to 15,000 troops. NATO's headaches aren't just across the border. They're also inside the tent. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, long seen as friendly to the Kremlin, now says NATO may not be the best path for Slovakia and is pushing for military neutrality instead. It's the first time he's openly questioned Slovakia's membership, Slovak media report. His remark drew sharp pushback from Parliament and from President Peter Pellegrini. My colleague has the details.
Slovakia would only benefit from neutrality at a time when arms manufacturers are rubbing their hands in anticipation, and Europe is speaking of war. That's what Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico said on June 16th, ahead of a meeting with President Peter Pellegrini and leaders of political parties, just days before the NATO summit in The Hague. However, Fico added that this decision is not within his power. It's worth noting that the Slovak Prime Minister holds a pro-Russian stance and supports continued imports of Russian energy resources. His statements came amid NATO's plans to raise the mandatory defense spending of member states to 5% of GDP, with 3.5% allocated directly to military needs and the remaining 1.5% to defense-related infrastructure projects.
Would neutrality suit Slovakia? I'm asking this question clearly and officially. What war are we talking about? Who are we supposed to fight? Slovakia must firmly advocate for peace and avoid any military adventures. Unfortunately, the next world war is already knocking on the door.
Fico's remarks about potentially leaving NATO were criticized not only by the parliamentary opposition, but also by parties within his own ruling coalition. Michal Šimečka, leader of the largest opposition party, Progressive Slovakia, called Fico's words scandalous. In his view, such statements undermine Slovakia's foreign policy and play into Vladimir Putin's hands. President Peter Pellegrini stressed that this was the prime minister's personal opinion and called the idea provocative. According to him, it's essential that support for Slovakia's NATO membership be a clear part of the government's official program. He also promised not to break NATO consensus at the upcoming summit on June 24th to 25th.
Being a neutral country doesn't mean you're so nice that everyone around you is your friend and nobody can hurt you. Neutrality means you're not part of major international institutions. And then you have to guarantee everything yourself. And in that case, it might not be about spending 3.5% on defense, but maybe 7, 8, even 10%, which we simply wouldn't be able to manage.
On June 17th, President Pellegrini warned that continuing discussions about leaving NATO could ultimately lead to a national referendum on the issue.
Let's not open the door to discussions that could endanger the security of the Slovak Republic. The security of our country must be the top priority, above geopolitics and above gaining a few cheap percentage points points from several tens of thousands of voters.
As several Western media outlets have pointed out, no country has ever left NATO since its founding in 1949. Withdrawing from the alliance is a complicated process that, among other things, would require parliamentary approval. Slovakia has been a NATO member since 2004. Analysts emphasize that the decision to exit NATO is not up to Robert Fico alone.
The comment has no near-term practical implications, but is the latest in a stream of anti-Western positions Fico has taken since taking office for the fourth time in 2023. Fico has been on a collision course with Western partners, taking a pro-Russian stance on the war in Ukraine and sparring with the European Union over Slovakia's desire to continue importing Russian gas and oil, as well as domestic reforms affecting justice and media. From the Reuters publication,
According to analysts, Fico's increasingly anti-Western rhetoric may be part of a broader strategy to position himself for early parliamentary elections. He may be trying to attract voters from far-right parties, which are more skeptical of the EU and friendlier toward Russia, even though his party officially promotes a social democratic ideology. However, polling data suggests that if early elections were held, Fico's current coalition would be unlikely to retain a parliamentary majority. Reported by Kristina Dombrovska, UATV News.
North Korea plans to ship as many as 25,000 workers to a Russian drone plant, hoping to pick up on UAV know-how in return. Japanese broadcaster NHK reports that the laborers are set to be sent to the Albuga complex in Tartastan. That factory turned out more than 6,000 attack drones and thousands of decoys last year. Moscow's goal for 2025, 8,000 to 10,000 kamikaze drones, all aimed at Ukraine for now, and possibly at NATO later.
NHK has learned that North Korea is considering sending workers to a drone manufacturer in Russia to boost production in exchange for training in how to operate the unmanned aircraft. Military cooperation between Russia and North Korea continues to deepen as Russia increases its production of drones amid its invasion of Ukraine. North Korea, meanwhile, aims to strengthen its military. From the publication of the Japanese media NHK.
The Canadian government has expanded its sanctions against Russia. The list includes officials who were once in Putin's inner circle. Ottawa also targeted dozens of Russian firms and hundreds of shadow fleet tankers that move sanctioned oil. Details on the fresh penalties in the report that follows.
Following the G7 summit held in Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced new sanctions against Russian individuals, entities, and over 200 vessels of the so-called shadow fleet that transport oil above the established price cap.
Canada is announcing today several measures, sanctions, first and foremost, against a number of individuals in Russia, against over 40 entities in Russia and beyond that are trying to contribute to the evasion of sanctions, the sanctioning of over 200 vessels in the shadow fleet that Russia is using, again, to try to evade these sanctions.
The Canadian government added 77 individuals, 39 companies, and 201 vessels of Russia's shadow fleet to its sanctions list. Among those targeted is Anatoly Chubais, former head of Rusnano, former head of the Russian presidential administration, and first deputy prime minister. Canada became the first G7 country to impose sanctions on Chubais, who left Russia for Israel after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The list also includes Tatiana Yumasheva, daughter of Russia's first president Boris Yeltsin, her husband, former presidential administration head Valentin Yumashev, and dictator Putin's ex-wife, Lyudmila Okoretnaya.
The sanctions list includes the artistic director of the Mariinsky Theater and director of the Bolshoi Theater, Valery Gergiev, billionaire Vladimir Yevtushenkov, chairman of Gazprom Neft's board, Alexander Dukov, head of InfoWatch Natalia Kasperskaya, former executive director of Nord Stream 2, AG Matthias Warnig, former Austrian foreign minister Karin Kneissel, and others, from a publication by the Moscow Times.
According to the Canadian government, sanctions have been tightened against Surgutneftegas, with restrictions imposed on 3 financial organizations and 15 individuals and companies linked to Russia's shadow fleet, which transports oil above the price cap. Moreover, Ottawa also banned the export of goods related to chemical and biological weapons production, industrial products, and dual-use advanced technologies. Import restrictions from Russia now cover coal, metals, and other revenue-generating goods.
This is one of Canada's most important sanctions announcements since Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, comprising its biggest ever package of vessel and trade-related sanctions. Anita Anand, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada, from Ministry website.
The day prior, the United Kingdom expanded its sanctions list against Russia, targeting nearly 2,500 individuals and entities, according to a government statement. The blacklist added 20 vessels of the Kremlin's tanker fleet, 15 of which were included based on recommendations from the Yermak's-McFall expert group. Key targets include Rosneft Enterprises, companies servicing the shadow tanker fleet, and several individuals and organizations aiding Moscow's military objectives.
The latest UK sanctions against Russia underscore the G7's unity in continuing pressure on Russia. This is another step in our joint work. Isolating Russia's economy, which funds its military-industrial complex, is essential. Andriy Yermak, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, on Telegram.
The European Union is currently developing its 18th sanctions package against Russia, which will include restrictions on energy, banking, and tightened export bans. According to EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Kaja Kallas, the EU must do more for Ukraine and its own security.
If we don't help Ukraine further, we should all start learning Russian. The stronger Ukraine is on the battlefield today, the stronger they will be around the negotiation table when Russia finally is ready to talk.
G7 leaders agreed to intensify sanctions against Russia, as stated by French President Emmanuel Macron on the sidelines of the summit in Canada. The issue was discussed in coordination with Canada, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Reported by Victoria Smirnova, UATV News.
Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha says Russia isn't stopping with Ukraine. Speaking at the GlobeSec 2025 forum in Prague, he warned that Kremlin planners are stockpiling strategic reserves for possible strikes beyond Ukraine's borders. Sybiha's message to Kyiv's partners? Only a full-court diplomatic press can head off Moscow. Kristina Dombrowska has the details.
Putin only understands force. That's why it is crucial to apply sanctions now as an economic weapon to pressure Russia, stated Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs Andriy Sybiha at the GlobeSec 2025 International Forum in Prague.
We want to end this war this year. And we do really have a chance to speed up our peace efforts. Most fundamental step on our efforts to achieve long-lasting peace, just peace, is ceasefire. Unconditional full ceasefire, and we need to pressure Russia to say unconditional yes for ceasefire. And after this, we have a chance to speed up our peace efforts and to start negotiations on broader peace agreement.
What it will take to get to a ceasefire is squeezing Putin's finances, so he has a very hard time keeping the Russian state afloat and conducting this war if he doesn't have revenue.
Strengthening Ukraine's defense capabilities is another factor that could force Russia to stop its war against Ukraine. Andriy Sybiha believes the Czech Republic will continue active participation in the coalition of the willing and reaffirmed its initiative to supply ammunition. Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipovsky assured his Ukrainian counterpart that Prague intends to deliver more ammunition to Kyiv in 2025 than it did in 2024. Ukraine, he noted, has long moved from being a recipient of support to becoming an equal strategic partner in European security.
It's in our interest that we cooperate with Ukraine on our security, because now Ukraine possesses some of the state-of-the-art technologies, which possibly we want to have them too. So the only way to be part of that is to be doing things in Ukraine and doing things with Ukrainians. And Ukraine is not that country which capital will be defeated in 3 days, but it's a strategic partner in building up European security. And this is the understanding to which everything is moving right now. So it's in our interest that Ukraine is on our side and that we craft this strategic partnership, and that we will integrate with Ukraine in so many fields.
Ukraine's foreign minister also urged participants of the Weimar Plus meeting to increase destructive sanctions pressure on the aggressor state. Ministers of foreign affairs from Ukraine, France, Germany, Poland, Spain, the UK, the European Union, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte gathered in Rome at the invitation of Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani.
They, Russia, are hitting civilians, they are hitting children, they are hitting hospitals. Therefore, this war must be ended, and Ukraine is ready for this. We count on ending this war this year. Therefore, it is so important to put pressure on the aggressor to achieve a ceasefire, which will open the way for further broad negotiations.
In Rome, Andris Sabiha met with EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Kaja Kallas, to discuss the situation on the front lines, Ukraine and the West's peace efforts, and Kyiv's top priority needs. The heads of foreign ministries from Ukraine and the EU coordinated steps to increase pressure on Moscow, including discussions of the EU's 18th sanctions package.
We put forward a very strong package, including, sanctions on banks, full transaction ban, also for the energy companies, as well as the oil price cap, and then military industry, addressing military industry as well.
Following the Rome meeting, the foreign ministers of European countries declared their readiness to step up sanctions pressure on Russia, reported by Kristina Dombrowska, UATV News.
That's it for this episode of Weekly Wrap-Up for UATV. I'm Jared Goyette. To be honest, it's been a long, heavy week in Kyiv. The morning after the strike, I was out reporting at the scene of that high-rise that Russia hit with a missile. A father stood there for hours, as close as rescue crews would let him, waiting for news about his son. When the word came, it wasn't what he'd hoped for. So just a reminder, hug the people you can while you can, and Slava Ukraini.